notes.
Very happy.
As further evidence that they're still thinking about this in the weeks after. So that was from October 29th, 1962. Exactly 1 month later, they're still watching these, Tim called them frogs or lunar. They're free-range overground rockets. These are tactical nuclear weapons. This particular clip I want to show you now is actually from November 29th, 1962. And I think it is actually one of the best examples of why the tapes matter. Because it shows something you don't see in a public position. But more importantly, it shows President Kennedy with different hats on. You'll hear him thinking as a commander-in-chief, thinking as a diplomat, trying to put himself in the other person's shoes, thinking as a politician. And what they're talking about, after the November 20 deal, Soviets still have combat troops in Cuba. Kennedy is trying to decide, well, is it better for us to leave them there? Or is it better for us to get them out, but in exchange pay a price for promising never to invade Cuba?
Isn't this our problem? I think one of our problems is that they will not take out those guard units, the removal of these, a lot of these other weapons until they feel they have an ironclad guarantee against invasion. So that we have to decide whether we'd rather have those units in and not have the guarantee or the assurance, or because I don't think you have it both ways. You don't give them the assurance they're not going to take out those units. There's really no incentive for them to do it. Well, we have not made those units a condition for the assurance we prepared to offer. That's correct, but I mean, that's as a practical matter, that's really what we're trying to do now is having the IL-28,000 and the missiles. We're trying now to prevent ourselves from having to give an assurance, which would psychologically be a source of strength to Castro and a source of difficulty for us here. We don't want to give the assurance. On the other hand, I think without the assurance, the chances of his taking out those guard units and these claws and all the rest, which he indicated or hinted that he would probably be doing in due time, I would think he wouldn't take them out. He'll say, well, you haven't given the assurance, but we've got to maintain our defensive strength to protect Cuba.
I'm going to cut that one short in the interest of time, but that is essentially the decision that he could not possibly say in public, and actually in public he kept pressure on the Soviets about it, and actually the clip that Ted's going to play in a moment refers to this again. But in private they decided not to push to get the Soviet combat troops out of Cuba. Now this actually has an echo in 1979. Jimmy Carter faces this major crisis about when a Soviet brigade is suddenly discovered in Cuba. This becomes a major problem for explorations toward Détente and everywhere else. At the time, McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor, who was one of the people speaking here, wrote a New York Times op-ed and said, oops, I think that was us. This is the decision, where it came from. Essentially, the Kennedy administration had decided not to push this issue because the price was too high. They did not want to offer a guarantee against invasion to Cuba.
Something really important to keep in mind, I believe, is that President Kennedy had a sense of acceptable risks that comes through these tapes. He knew that a risk-free environment was impossible, and so he thought, what can we afford to, what can we let the Soviets keep in Cuba, because how far do we want to push them? We've just escaped nuclear war. We got the big missiles out. To what extent do we need everything out? That's a tough decision for a president to make, and think about the domestic political consequences, because what happens if the party that's not in power discovers that you let some this or that in Cuba? What kind of domestic political problem would you have when they said, my goodness, the President of the United States has allowed the Soviets to keep, you fill in the blank, in Cuba? President Kennedy made that tough call. That was a very, very hard call to make. And think politically, that shows a lot of courage. Ted, talk to us about the Cuban Missile Crisis is not going to go away, but relations between the United States and the Soviet Union are going to improve. And Ted has selected a great clip to show that.
Well, they did improve a lot over the next year. David just helped us to understand how it went into November and beyond. And throughout 1963, there is a feeling that President Kennedy and Chairman Khrushchev have been to the brink and seen something basically that no one else had ever seen, and they have a new understanding of each other. And that even begins to become evident in the quite emotional letters that Khrushchev was sending to President Kennedy throughout the crisis. And I think they had a shared sense that they were not merely the titular adversaries of each other, but neither was entirely in control of his military. And there was a common understanding there that near the end of the crisis, they realized they had to together solve the crisis, working in some ways against the hardliners on both sides. And so a very interesting dialogue begins, often through third parties. The journalist Norman Cousins, a not terribly well-known journalist today, and maybe not even all that well-known in the day, carried messages, often via the Vatican. Pope John the 23rd was involved in this interesting diplomacy, and there were other channels. But the atmosphere improved, and the chief political achievement of 1963 in the realm of foreign affairs was the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which went forward throughout the year and involved a lot of heavy lifting, including here at home with Congress, a Congress that was not at first inclined to support it. Ultimately, the Senate did ratify it, but it was a great achievement. It was a British achievement as well as an American and a Russian achievement. And that did improve the atmosphere. It improved the atmosphere, prevented nuclear weapons going off in the atmosphere, but it also improved the political atmosphere. And even US-Cuban relations appear to have been improving. There were private explorations. Americans were sent to talk to Castro. One former OSS officer named James Donovan had a meeting with Castro and said, what would it look like if the US and Cuba were to try to have a better relationship? How would it happen? And Castro thought a second and said, like porcupines making love, very carefully. And that was the that was the feeling in the air in the late summer and early fall of 1963. And in that time, Andre Gromyko comes for a high-level discussion with President Kennedy of the state of Soviet-American relations. And Gromyko is the same guy who'd lied blatantly to President Kennedy on October 18th, saying there were no missiles in Cuba when the President knew there were. The President called him that lying bastard for a while, and a year later everything's different. They have a very friendly conversation. You get the feeling Gromyko's a little down, that he's just a little depressed. And Kennedy's saying, you know, our relationship is a lot better. We're doing okay. Our military spending is down. We've solved a lot of our problems. And it's interesting. It's a moment that reminds us how much personal diplomacy is still important in the relationship between countries. I think President Kennedy's trying to cheer him up because the feeling a year later was that the United States had, in a way, defeated the Soviet Union. And to some extent, that was true. Perhaps that's not quite the right word to use, but it's also a human moment because in the middle of the conversation, they're interrupted by the sound of children. And Caroline and John come in, and they enter into this high-stakes diplomatic conversation, which includes a discussion of their pet, Pushinka, who'd been sent by Khrushchev to Kennedy. Pushinka is Russian for fluffy. And it's just a great moment in the ever-evolving Soviet-American relationship.
I think we've done, Mr. Mayor, I don't want you to get discouraged. We've done, you may not be conscious of much progress where you sit, but we've been pulling and hauling around the United States for the last 3 months in several directions, and we think for us, we've made some progress in our relations with the Soviet Union. We may not get the German question disposed of, we may not have solved all the matters, but considering some of the difficulties that both our countries face, and internally and externally, it seems to me we've done pretty well. So I'm rather encouraged, not discouraged. I don't want you to be discouraged.
Well, there is improvement.
There is only a certain tempo that you can move in these matters. We had with the test ban, we've some progress, which for the United States is rather, we realized that in the summer of 1961, the Congress unanimously passed resolutions against trade with the Soviets. Now we're going ahead, we hope, with this very large trade arrangement that represents a change in American policy of some proportions.
that's some progress. You are right, Mr. President, there is change in the atmosphere, in the broad sense of this word, international atmosphere, and in more narrow but important one, as far as our relations, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union concerned. Maybe it is not easy now to formalize our officially our understanding. But even any understanding in any form, official form, some kind of basis of the gentleman understanding would be helpful that the powers will act in this direction. They are institutions.
Just have you say hello to my daughter and son. Come here in a minute. Say hello. Want to say hello to the minister? Hello. You want to say hello to John? Hello. You know, they well, I heard a great deal about that. Okay. They are very popular in our country. Oh, brother, his chief is the one who sent you for shake-up. You know that? You know the puppies.
That might be Khrushchev.
Or John.
You do not have any secrets from them, So, Mr. President, I mentioned
That's a long clip, but it's a great.
I think we've done, Mr. Mayor, I don't want you to get discouraged. We've done, you may not be.
I don't know, it's just the idea of Gromyko, who was such a sourpuss,
Yeah.
sitting there with the president's children. It's hilarious. Can you
Well-
imagine can you imagine the scene?
He actually has a belly laugh there for a second. He speaks in a monotone, that deep voice.
Do you remember? Remember Pushinka? What did you say?
Well, he just comes out of that monotone there. There's a moment where he just can't help it, and a big belly laugh comes out, and it's a nice moment that shows how far we had come in almost a year. I think this is October 10th, 1963, and it was October 18th, 1962, that Gromyko sat there and denied that there were missiles in Cuba, and Kennedy was furious. And so everyone had come a long way.
Ted mentioned the importance of not screaming victory. And the president understood that the Cuban Missile Crisis had been a great moment for American diplomacy and for his leadership, but that it would only be a great moment if he didn't humiliate the Soviets.
Right.
And for those of us who weren't around then, a very similar decision, I think, was George Herbert Walker Bush's decision not to dance on the Berlin Wall. Similar kind of self-discipline. When the Soviets suffered an enormous defeat, we benefited, and we appeared magnanimous.
It's a very good point.
Let's open this to questions. If you wish to ask a question, come to either that mic or that one over there, please. Yes, please. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation tonight. My name is Aaron Hurtis. I'm curious if you can walk us through the history of these recording systems, how they were installed, how that evolved. And I'm really curious to know if there's anything like that for recent presidents and maybe some of the changes that have been brought around by...
I'm sorry. This is giving me a headache thinking about a recent president with tapes. Yes. David, would you like to handle that, please?
Well, and I'm curious about other forms of communication we have now, like email, how those are preserved, and if we're learning or if we might learn more from presidents who've had access to those newer technologies?
I'm going to give you a very short answer to that. But there were 6 presidents who secretly taped, started in 1940, ended with Nixon. They all taped independently. This was not some law that they had to tape in the White House. They had all decided for their own purposes to record in the White House. The short version as far as whether there are recent presidents is that after Watergate, it became a very bad idea to tape in the White House.
But guess which president thought about doing it? Anybody guess? Who would a president who would want to be viewed as John F. Kennedy? Bill Clinton brought up the idea of having a taping system, and guess what his general counsel said? So what did he do? He taped meetings with Taylor Branch every night, or not every night, but often.
About once a week.
Yeah. And you were in the Clinton administration.
I was.
And did you know that the president has actually considered this?
No, I didn't at the time. I didn't know about the Taylor Branch meetings at first, but I later knew about them. And there were several note-taking systems. There was someone called the diarist who just wrote down, all the meetings, who was in them every day. The meetings with Taylor Branch happened at night. He has now described them in his book, Wrestling with the Clinton Tapes, I think it's called, Wrestling with History. And it's a conundrum, because after Nixon, no one wants to be seen as taping, but it's a great loss to historians. And to know with the detail that we do know about these presidencies that were taping is really very helpful to all of us. And I think in many ways it's good for democracy, because we can evaluate what happens in an Oval Office that is usually pretty close to the public. So it's a complicated topic.
Sir.
You mentioned that the United States exercised discretion and not kind of gloating over the victory of the crisis. But the Soviets did too, and I was surprised to hear that when they kept the agreement to withdraw the missiles from Turkey quiet for a number of years. Didn't come out to some time later. And I think, again, it was totally out of character from everything I read about Khrushchev to do that, but he did it, and it kind of smoothed the waters, but most people didn't know about that until some time later.
Well, Khrushchev had a problem. The Turkish missiles were not removed by the United States for 4 months after the crisis. So if he had actually gone public at the end of the crisis, since President Kennedy, through his brother Bobby, had said, you mustn't make this public, he could have welched on the promise, because the Soviets had to remove their missiles immediately, and the Turkish missiles were not removed for 4 months. So there was a reason for Khrushchev not to gloat publicly. But what's really interesting is he didn't gloat privately either. When he talked about what he thought he got out of this crisis, he focused more on the fact that he got a guarantee that the United States would not invade Cuba. Yes?
Realistically, the time when this happened was not the 24/7 news cycle. There weren't the fact that everybody at their own desk can be a newspaper publisher. If this had happened even 40 years later, could people have actually had the time to think through things? Could we have avoided what we avoided in this case?
It's a great question. Probably not. I have to think that the news would have leaked out more easily now. As you say, we're all journalists. We all have our phones are so many things. They're cameras, they are typewriters, and it just would have gotten out. This was an age in which communications technology was still evolving quite quickly, but was slow in Cuba. As it still is slow in Cuba. One of the big problems the Soviets had with their Cuban allies is the Cubans who knew about the missiles were talking about them in the bars of Havana. The Cubans like to talk. And yet there were so few Americans in Havana that their secret lasted a pretty long time before we knew about the missiles. And then we had this crucial 6 days from October 16th, the day the crisis begins, to October 22nd, the day of the speech, when there was a pretty effective blackout of all news concerning the crisis, and elaborate, well, actually very simple measures were taken. The first meeting, I think 8 of the members of ExComm rode in the same car together to avoid the appearance of a lot of limousines all pulled up at the White House. And those simple strategies worked, and they had that crucial privacy. But the lid was coming off around Sunday and Monday. The day of the speech, October 22nd, reports were filtering into the mainstream press, and so it was coming out. But and I think now, as you say, with the 24/7 news cycle, with far more reporters, with reporters everywhere in the form of stringers and just people with curiosity photographing everything, I think it would have come out much faster.
David, do you want to say something about President Kennedy's efforts, nevertheless, to manage the news?
Yeah, it actually, during the crisis, the White House had clamped down on the flow of news information. There were very good national security reasons for doing that during the crisis. But this actually becomes a real problem afterwards because the White House and the Defense Department, the State Department, kept clamping down on the flow of information. And so what you had, or what you ended up with, was a press corps who could no longer understand or no longer tolerate having that constricted flow of information. There was actually a major crisis called the news management crisis that erupted through November 1962 through early 1963, where there's this backlash about this control of information that stays in force, and it's all part of the story about how the Cuban Missile Crisis story comes out then and is filtered out because the White House is sort of selectively siphoning information to certain reporters but is restricting information to other reporters. So it's a very interesting part of that story about sort of how we remember the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Sir,
Two questions.
just one, please. I'm going to try to get everybody in.
Well,
Please.
I'll ask the more interesting one then. How accurate a portrait of Curtis LeMay is Colonel Ripper?
Look at me.
He's the colonel in the Stanley Kubrick film Dr. Strangelove, and I think pretty accurate. It's worth, this is just a tangent, but Curtis LeMay stays in American history in a very public way, and in 1968 he's the running mate of George Wallace, which interestingly combines several of the problems President Kennedy had in 1962 and 63. He's also fighting pretty hard domestic political opposition over civil rights, which is really heating up a lot in exactly this time. And one of the more interesting details I only just learned, I mean, we just keep reading and learning more, is that as this massive invasion force was assembling in Florida, David was describing, they had a lot of problems with unruly behavior because a lot of the military police were on assignment elsewhere in the South trying to manage the civil rights crisis. So all these crises, even though they're different, they were affecting each other. And that isn't, I mean, I do think there's a lot of similarity in that movie, but I wanted to add that point about
Thank you for the one question. Yes.
This is for David. You alluded in your book a lot to, and you sort of just touched on it, media relations and the media leaks and of sensitive information, and I guess some of the extreme measures that the administration took, illegal wiretaps, surveillance of reporters, that type of thing. And you also specifically mentioned two reporters in your book, Paul Scott and Robert Allen. And just by way of full disclosure, Paul Scott was my father. But I guess it's a two-part question, but it really you can answer it as one.
Well, actually, it's just become a one-part question.
I guess the means that the President Kennedy felt he had to pursue to quell a lot of leaks and some information that certainly shouldn't have gotten out got out. And I guess the other part of the question is my dad was illegally wiretapped. 50 years later, I'm still having a lot of trouble figuring out what happened and why, et cetera, a lot of redacted information from the CIA. I'm just wondering if you, in your research, in your efforts, if you can sort of pull the veil away from why a lot of information that took place 50 years ago is still under wraps.
We're in the National Archives, and the National Archives is responsible for a lot of that types of information. I'm afraid I'm not in a position to. That type of information, I don't have a good answer for as to why it's still locked up. There is a lot of other information you might surprise you from 50 years ago that is still locked up, and that's usually things to do with nuclear weapons or sources and methods for intelligence collection and things like that. I don't have a good answer. I can't speak for the CIA. I can't speak for the National Archives, I'm afraid. So I don't know why that information is still closed.
The National Archives is a custodian of other people's materials. decisions about disclosure are made by the organizations that created the document. If the wiretapping that you mentioned was done by the CIA, it's the CIA that's holding it up. If it was done by the FBI, it's their fault. They're the people to send the letter to. Freedom of Information Act. Okay. I want you all to have a chance to ask your question, but I'm going to clump them together because I'd like you to have an opportunity to buy some books. So if you could just state your question, please. I will try to keep note of them, and yours. And do we have 4 there or 3? 3. And each of you, then the panelists will decide, we'll answer them. I promise. So please, let's start with you, sir.
Yes, maybe you covered this, but we got in late. Why was Khrushchev willing to back down, particularly to the extent of agreeing to the delayed implementation of removing the missiles from Turkey?
I can answer that quickly. He was afraid of war. We have now, since 2002, we have the Soviet minutes of the Presidium meetings, the meetings of the Politburo. And whenever he was fearful of war, that the United States would actually attack Cuba, he became more amenable to a concession. He did not want nuclear war. He put the missiles in. It's an argument that he put the missiles in largely to change the balance of power and to protect Cuba, which had become a symbol of the Soviet Union's leadership of the socialist world. And there was real tension between the Chinese and the Soviets over leadership in the world. And once he had that guarantee that the United States would not invade Cuba, that's all he really needed. But go ahead.
You listed several of the traits of leadership that JFK showed during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was interested in which traits you think Barack Obama shares with JFK and which he does not share, and even Mitt Romney, if you'd like, and what lessons we can take from this 13-day ordeal and apply to Iran and Syria and some of those conflicts.
Okay, well, we'll keep the Barack Obama question in the air, and well, let me add to it this one.
Paul Porter. I'm a veteran, and about 18 years ago, the president's example inspired me to put on the uniform. And this is really a question for Caroline. I wondered if her dad's experience as a veteran made him both more reluctant and more confident to not engage in warfare than other people that held the office. If you'll take it.
I will add the experience of war question, and the panelists will address it. Thank you, Ms. Schlossberg. Yes, your question.
The Bush administration had a lot of pushback by the Joint Chiefs at the height of the Iraq War, particularly 2005, 2006. And I think the difference is not, of course, an analogous situation in the Kennedy administration, but the difference being that the Bush White House kind of actually circumvented the Joint Chiefs of Staff by developing its own, as you gentlemen know, its own war plan and then implementing it, whereas the Kennedys, I think, were a lot cooler and more decisive. Yeah.
Yep.
And the last.
Any evidence of communication between the administration and the NATO allies or Khrushchev and the Soviet Bloc partners either during or in the aftermath of the crisis?
Okay, have at it.
Yes. There's actually a very interesting conversation that turned up in 2004, well after a lot of these other tapes from the 13 days came out, which is actually a transatlantic telephone call between President Kennedy and Harold Macmillan. That's a really interesting conversation to listen to, but of course the diplomatic missions were going full throttle in Paris and NATO and everything else, and Tim is the expert on the Soviet side of things, so if anyone knows about Warsaw Pact stuff, it's probably Tim.
In the interest of time, and it's actually really boring, I'd say yes, we can talk afterwards. Next, what would you like to say?
I do think Barack Obama resembles President Kennedy in many ways and is a deliberative decision maker. I don't think he resembles him in every way. I think President Kennedy loved the give and take of politics, of retail politics a little more. He just loved getting out there. And I don't quite get that feeling from President Obama, but I think in terms of serious deliberative decisions, yes, I think the points I was trying to make apply. I think the other parallel to the situation with Iraq is very interesting. I think there was another situation where a president didn't see eye to eye with his Joint Chiefs, but it had flipped. So the Joint Chiefs were really skeptical of war, and it was the politicians who wanted to go to war. So it was very different from 1962. And I agree with Caroline and with the questioner that the people of World War II had a very realistic sense of war that we may have lost. It was a very valuable asset, that they'd seen terrible bloodshed. Both President Kennedy and Chairman Khrushchev had seen horrible bloodshed in the Soviet Union, and that was an asset that helped to get us to the peace that they found.
Would you like to address the question of civil-military relations in the context of the Iraq War and how it compares or doesn't to Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, I agree that the politicians had a war plan that they circumvented the military planners with, and also just, I mean, the point I just made, that I think it's interesting that the military advisors were far more hesitant to go to war in Iraq than the politicians were. So in that sense, I think history had come full circle.
David, you want to address any of those questions?
Yeah, just the sense of any similarities between President Obama and President Kennedy. I think, watching from afar, and obviously I have no insights into the current administration other than what any of us see, I get the sense that they both bristle at absolutes. That as a president, you often have to go into absolutes, but both of these people seemed much more comfortable in nuance, in reasonableness, in thinking what the other person's thinking. And that's something that comes through in some of the tapes we've been playing tonight. But that's just a sense that I get, that they bristle at sort of having been pushed into absolutes, particularly in the political fray.
Closing remarks from either of you? Want to say something?
Well, you said earlier, and I agree, that we just continue to learn from this crisis, that the information is still coming out. It's coming out from these tapes, which I commend the Kennedy Library for releasing and putting online. It's a great step forward. We talked about the technology of cell phones and how we probably would have noticed the missiles now if it happened now, but also the technology of home computers is incredible, because you can hear this in your house now, and it just means there's no separation. You can go into the Oval Office and listen, and it's a great benefit to all of us who love history. And I think it's a benefit to those of us who want to be good citizens, because we can think about the very complex issues that a president has to wrestle with. And it takes away the partisan edge. It makes us think that these people have a really hard job, and they're generally doing a good job. So I think we've come a long way, and we should not consider it final knowledge. We should keep trying to learn more as new facts come out.
David?
I would commend, I think these are one of the many gems in the National Archives system. And it's not just the Kennedy tapes, which Ted said the Kennedy Library does a fantastic job with, but I would recommend to you to go and listen to these tapes. They're now the property of the United States government, and therefore the property of you. But you get to hear government at work, and you get it without all of the spin, and you get it unfiltered, unrehearsed. Not just the Kennedy tapes, but you can go to the Kennedy Library and listen to those, but you've also got Roosevelt tapes, Truman tapes, Eisenhower tapes, Johnson tapes, which I'm sure many of you have heard, and Nixon tapes as well. These are fantastic resources and unique resources for understanding how the government works. And I would commend them to you to go and listen to them, read about them, and find out sort of a very different perspective for how historians are using these types of resources.
Well, you have a chance to read some of what has been discussed tonight, because back outside, on sale, Ted's book, Listening In, David's book, On the 14th Day, and if for some reason you're interested in the Soviets and the Cubans, my book, One Hell of a Gamble. Thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you, Ted. Thank you, David. It's wonderful.